So the first concern of the court was whether or not Mr. Ferguson was suffering from some sort of intellectual disability, whether it be autism or something else. And there's a couple references to that throughout his Dr. Shazer's report. And specifically, the first reference that the court had highlighted was on page 2 of the report, first full paragraph, and it says, in my opinion, he, referring to Mr. Ferguson, was clearly neither psychotic nor suffering from symptoms of a mood disorder at the time of the current interview, and he was apparently functioning within at least the normal range of intellectual ability at this time. Thus, in my opinion, he does not suffer from a chronic psychotic disorder, a chronic mood disorder, or an intellectual disability. There's another reference more to the end of the report where he indicates, thus, his referring to Mr. Ferguson, his educational history is inconsistent with him suffering from intellectual deficits, and as noted above, he was apparently functioning within at least the normal range of intellectual ability at the time of the current interview. In my opinion, the defendant clearly does not suffer from an intellectual disability. So the court, that was helpful to the court because and some of the letters that I received as well, Mr. Roberts indicated that there was concern that Mr. Ferguson was autistic. And I think probably more toward that was easier to maybe manipulate him and that kind of thing. And certainly the court does take someone's intellectual capacity into consideration. I think it's important to understand the full situation. So the court, and although those are two small portions of the opinion that the court referenced, they're borne out by much more in detail history in Dr. Shazer's report. Specifically, Dr. Shazer analyzed every statement that the defendant gave to the police. He also watched the testimony of Mr. Ferguson, interviewed him himself. He also looked through his history from the Oklahoma Department of Health and Human Services. He looked through his history from school records, from various psychological assessments that were conducted throughout his life based on the report. So I think that opinion is well-grounded in not only his interview, his review of educational records, his review of mental health records, and everything else, Health West records currently from when he was assessed when he became in the Muskegon County Jail. So the court finds that to be quite persuasive in terms of whether or not Mr. Ferguson is suffering from any intellectual disability, and the court concludes based on this report, well-written report, well-grounded in fact and history of the defendant, that he was not suffering from an intellectual disability currently or at the time of this offense. The second thing is whether or not Mr. Ferguson was somehow manipulated or coerced by his mother. I think all of us would like to believe that this is a product of manipulation, that this is simply somebody doing something that they were told to do, that they were afraid. Mr. Eldon Brady mentioned it in his allocution regarding the specific text messages. Well, those specific text messages I heard as well at the trial. Shortly after the trial concluded, I had asked the prosecutor's office for a complete copy of every single text messages that would occur between Ms. Vander Ark and Mr. Ferguson, because I didn't want just the snippets, the kind of highlights or the real, juicy stuff, for lack of a better term. I wanted to understand completely what the conversation was between these individuals. I read every single text message, every one of them. I think there's thousands in there, and I've read it 3 times now, 3 times in total. I read it, 2 months ago, I read it a month ago, and I read it last week, Friday. The entire afternoon was spent reading through these things, and I think it's clear to me that Mr. Ferguson, although he says that he was scared of his mother, or there's an allegation of that standpoint, I find that just the opposite to be true based on those text messages. There is some mention about punishment, but I think Mr. Ferguson, in my opinion, being submissive, for lack of a better term, to his mother was a result that he really had nowhere else to go. He had been kicked out from his father's house for failing to obey his father's rules and for other things. And he went to his mother's house, and I don't think Mr. Ferguson really had anywhere else to go. I think he was sort of beholden to his mother in terms of, well, there's going to be consequences. Although there are some text messages, one or two of those that bear that out, this strikes me in the text messages as more of a collaborative effort. In fact, there's some text messages where Ms. Vander Ark actually tells Mr. Ferguson that if Ms. Timothy does not behave, essentially, I'm going to leave him to you, as in that he's going to let the dog out and just log off the chain. And Mr. Ferguson also several times essentially tells his mother things that are going on that are bad. And I think it's because he wants his mother to give him the permission to go ahead and engage in punishment. So in terms of whether or not his mother, he was somehow afraid of his mother, I don't think that to be the case. Now, that was my initial feeling about it and what I took it as, and that's why I wanted the assessment regarding whether or not he was being manipulated. And luckily, we did get one from the second one I referenced was from Dr. Farhat, which is specifically, I think he was asked to assess this particular question. And in the beginning of his assessment, he says that specifically, I was asked to assess whether Mr. Ferguson possessed a psychological disorder of traits that would render him significantly susceptible to manipulation, coercion, or suggestibility. After conducting the evaluation, I could not substantiate these traits as they pertain to the commission of the offense. As such, this report will instead explain the nature of the evaluation and my overall opinions regarding Mr. Ferguson's psychological functioning. He also opined regarding his intellectual abilities. He says, from a diagnostic standpoint, I did not find sufficient evidence to support Mr. Ferguson meeting criteria for any specific mental disorder. While one may consider whether his presentation suggested a neurodevelopmental condition, e.g. autism spectrum disorder, I did not find this to be an appropriate label. Instead, I attributed his overall demeanor and presentation to factors such as a lack of socialization, normalization of abnormal dynamics and experiences, poor interpersonal skills, and emotional dysregulation. He also indicated later on that page that I was initially asked to evaluate whether Mr. Ferguson had a mental condition or traits that would have rendered him susceptible to coercion, manipulation, or suggestibility at the time of the offense. Ultimately, I could not arrive at this conclusion based on the totality of the available information. Available evidence noted that he was capable of appreciating the abuse towards his brother, that he was capable of recognizing the detrimental impact it had, and that he at times disobeyed Ms. Vander Ark and tried to provide his brother with aid and support. Furthermore, despite reporting that he was under Ms. Vander Ark's, quote, psychological hold, he adamantly denied that he was coerced or manipulated into enforcing the abuse. Additionally, he recognized to some degree pleasure in having power and control over his younger brother. In this sense, while I acknowledge that he reported experiencing fear and concerns of disobeying Ms. Vander Ark, I could not reliably substantiate his involvement as being a byproduct of suggestibility or coercion. So what this court is left to conclude is that Mr. Ferguson, the way I look at this is that Mr. Ferguson in these reports, and a lot of these, throughout the report, there's talk about how Mr. Ferguson bullied his brother when he was younger. There's a mention, his stepsister, who I think was allocated on behalf of his mother, or on behalf of Timothy at Miss Vander Ark's sentencing. He says the stepsister, and this is before the police even really told her about exactly what had happened in here. It says the stepsister reportedly told the police that, quote, she doesn't know how involved Paul was in this situation, but he is the biggest bully she has ever met in her life, and he found genuine joy in tormenting Timothy whenever possible.
Judge, for clarification, I don't think that was Millie, that the
Okay,
stepsister.
so maybe I'm wrong.
Millie, yeah.
Okay, so perhaps I'm wrong about that. But this was someone who, without even knowing the full details, reported that. In one of the interviews, Mr. Ferguson indicated that he liked getting praised by Shanda and admitted he liked having control over Timothy. He reportedly admitted having power over somebody feels good. Later in the interview, I asked him whether he had felt ashamed at the time when he was abusing his brother, and he said, quote, no, he had not. I asked whether he had recognized his action as morally wrong at the time, and he again said, quote, no, he had not. He then volunteered that on one occasion, quote, I sent her a photo of how thin he was, and when I asked why he did this, he explained that I was worried. When asked when he was worried about Mr. Ferguson replied that he had been concerned for his health, observing that he was nothing but bones. I asked him whether he had, at the moment, thought that this abusive behavior was wrong, and he replied that, quote, that thought never even crossed my mind. A treatment plan back from July 22nd of 2012 indicates that, quote, client, meaning Mr. Ferguson, sometimes bullies his younger brother, the decedent, Timothy. The report also mentions cruelty to animals, stealing, abuse. His mother at the time, back in 2018, told staff at the clinic he's become bossy, telling his siblings what to do. For Mr. Ferguson's part, reportedly, when commenting about his being irritable, he admits that this is due to his younger siblings not listening. He gets physically aggressive towards his younger siblings. He also tried to lock his younger brother, i.e. apparently a reference to the decedent, in the closet because his brother wouldn't listen to him. So the court read this and certainly looks at this as someone who is predisposed, I think was the ultimate conclusion, predisposed to abuse his brother. Specifically, the victim in this case. He had a history of doing that. Now, I have no doubt in my mind that Mr. Ferguson is a result of years and years and years of physical neglect and abuse on behalf of his mother. No doubt in my mind. That's borne out in this report. But the court is asked to essentially ignore the decisions or his behavior because of that, and to somehow say that we're going to minimize the damage and what he did in this case because of that. If the court started imposing that standard, I think it would be in a real trouble, because every defendant that comes before this court has a horrible history, I would say. That's the reason they're here. People that have supportive parents and things go good for them typically don't come here. Now, that's not always the case. Believe me, there's a lot of interventions. But everybody has a history. And what I was looking at is whether or not this is a product of his mother or his situation. And what I can conclude is that this is not. Mr. Ferguson is trying to shift blame from his mother, from him to his mother, to say that somehow, well, if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have done this, or she's the one that did this. At the trial, well, at her order, he kept saying it over and over and over again as to just keep underscoring the point. And if that had been an isolated incident, if that had been one or two of these things, if that had been a punishment that he administered, maybe the court could accept that. But we have an individual who was in a household for 6 months, intentionally himself engaging in torture of another person. And he doesn't, well, I'm worried about my mom's gonna say. Clearly it's not borne out in these reports. He had the ability to disobey his mom. In fact, he was on the stand and almost boasted that, well, I gave him extra food. Well, weren't you worried about how your mom was gonna be upset? I still gave him extra food. So what that tells me is that this has been a careful, manipulated story by Mr. Ferguson from the very beginning of this thing, that he's going to put the blame on his mom. I'm going to be manipulated. I have Asperger's syndrome. I have autism. I have Stockholm syndrome. There's mention of him saying, well, maybe I have Stockholm syndrome in here. No, this is an individual. What the truth of this is that we have two individuals that lack empathy, who lack emotion, and both of them, the triggering factor in this report, the triggering factor that caused this abuse was the removal of the husband, of stepdad. Once he was gone, these two individuals were free to torture somebody, and they did it. That's what they did. And I think Ms. Vander Ark did use Mr. Ferguson. I think that she knew from his history that he was predisposed to torment Timothy. I think that she knew that he would have no problem doing that. And Mr. Ferguson walked through that door and was happy to be the enforcer, was happy to do it, and continued to torture his brother over and over and over and over until he was a shell of a person, until he was dead, died from starvation, died from hypothermia. He had no fat on him, barely any muscle on him. And the whole time, just letting it happen. The report says, it appears that the stepfather's presence in the home had prevented Paul and his mother from abusing the victim. Again, it wasn't anything to do, they were just holding him back, essentially. The overall opinion, which I think is important, is, in my opinion, although the defendant's participation in the abuse was in a part a function of his social milieu and living situation, these contextual factors were not a necessary condition for his participation. As previously noted, mental health records contain information to the effect that while they were still living with their father and stepmother and reportedly had no contact with their mother, Mr. Ferguson's stepmother told the psychiatrist that he has become bossy, telling his siblings what to do, and the defendant himself that he would become irritable due to his younger siblings not listening. He gets physically aggressive, told his younger sibling. He also reports that he's gotten irritated with his siblings and has pushed them in retaliation. He's also tried to lock his younger brother, the decedent, in the closet because his brothers wouldn't listen to him. Consistent with this, Norton Shores Police Department documents indicate that Mr. Ferguson's stepsister told police that, quote, he is the biggest bully she's ever met in her life, and he found genuine joy in tormenting Timothy whenever possible when they were living in the biological father's home. Notably, the defendant allegedly engaged in this abusive behavior despite there being any safety rules in place, and despite his father and stepmother disapproving of this behavior to such an extent that they removed him from their home once he turned 18 because of it. In my opinion, Paul Ferguson was predisposed to abuse his brother independent of his mother's present and active influence in his life. Nonetheless, in my opinion, Mr. Ferguson's involvement in repeated acts of abuse that amounted to physical and psychological torture over a period of months reflects a general lack of empathy for his brother and a lack of remorse for his actions. It concludes that, in my opinion, there is no reason to believe that Mr. Ferguson's conduct disorder has remitted or that his participation in the abuse of his brother was not an expression of a persistent pattern of antisocial conduct. The court is concerned that Mr. Ferguson will not get the help he needs in prison. I think he's one step away from becoming a psychopath like his mother, and the court is concerned that he represents a danger to the public. That if released, he would represent a significant danger to the public. The the charge here is child abuse. And I don't think this charge or the sentencing guidelines take into adequate consideration of the long sustained torture in this case. As I indicated in Ms. Vander Ark's testimony, there was a long period of months of various punishments, including bread with hot sauce. There's the hot sauce that apparently contains 2 of the hottest peppers that we have in the world. Wall sits for an individual who practically had no muscle left. Running up and down stairs, cleaning out a garage with no pants on, sleep deprivation in itself. Putting alarms on him so he couldn't move or sleep. Making him puke up food. There's bathroom timers. Sleeping in the closet with a tarp down, which quite frankly might be considered animal abuse, but we have a human being here. Making his hands over his head. And then at the end of his life, an 8-hour practically ice bath that killed him. So no, I don't think any of those things are adequately taken into consideration by the guidelines. And I don't think the guidelines, quite frankly, can even, these guidelines don't justify Mr. Ferguson's actions. Mr. Ferguson, I think you are a product of your environment, but I don't believe you that you're sorry. I don't. I don't think you have empathy. I don't think you have any emotion whatsoever. And that's what scares the court. It really scares me. I think you're sorry that you're here. I think you're sorry you got caught. I don't think you wanted Tim to die either, like your mother, because you would get caught and you wouldn't torture him anymore. And believe me, I've tried to sit here and try to think, well, maybe Mr. Ferguson's not as bad as Mom. I think you're just as bad, if not worse. If not worse. Because you had a job. You could have, Mr. Johnson actually asked you, couldn't you have brought home a thing of food for him? You could have gone to a neighbor and said, hey, my mom's abusing him. You could have grabbed him and got him out of there. You could have done any number of things to stop this, and you chose not to. Your own brother. And this is where we're at. So, based on all that, it's a sentence of the court. You serve 30 years to 100 years, Michigan Department of Corrections. Credit for 592 days you've already served. Court's going to assess a $68 state cost, $130 crime victim rights assessment. No additional fines and costs. Mr. Ferguson, you have a right to file an appeal in this case. If you're financially unable to retain an attorney, one will be appointed to a public expense. Request for the assistance of the lawyer must be made within 42 days from today's date. Clerk is handing you a form that you must complete. Return to the court in that 42 days if you wish to request the appointment of an attorney on appeal. We're adjourned.